Okay, let's unpack this. We are about to dive into, well, arguably the most intellectually taxing yet, yeah, deeply personal question in philosophy. The hard problem of consciousness.
It really is. This isn't just some abstract academic puzzle. It's about the very nature of your reality right now as you're listening.
Absolutely. And to set the scene, let's start with a thought experiment. It really gets to the heart of the friction here. Can a cold, blind, dead stone feel the fluttering wings of a butterfly landing on it?
I mean, intuitively, the answer is a resounding no, right?
Right.
The stone lacks something essential. It lacks awareness. It lacks what philosophers call intentionality, that quality of being about something else. And it lacks meaning. It's
Yeah.
just inert matter, fundamentally non-conscious.
Okay, and here's the kicker. For those committed to metaphysical naturalism, or what's often called physicalism.
Which is the view that everything boils down to physical stuff, right? Physical ingredients are all there is.
Exactly. If that's your starting point, then the entire universe, by definition, is essentially just one massive stone. It's just a vast collection of cold, non-conscious, blind physical processes. Atoms, electrons moving according to, well, indifferent natural laws.
And if that's the foundation, the paradox hits you immediately. How do you possibly explain the existence of our inner subjective conscious experiences? That first-person feeling, what it's like to be you. Philosophers sometimes call this qualia.
Right.
How does that arise from a base reality that seems to utterly lack the necessary ingredients? Life, awareness, meaning. How does something blind suddenly create sight or feeling?
That is precisely our mission today. We're going to do a deep dive into the arguments around this hard problem of consciousness. We want to assess whether theism, which, allows for a broader metaphysical picture,
One that includes the non-physical.
or naturalism physicalism, with its self-imposed restriction to only the physical, offers a more coherent, a more complete explanation for this miracle of our inner subjective reality.
And just to be clear for everyone listening, we'll be using physicalism and materialism more or less interchangeably here. It's the idea that physical facts alone have to explain everything.
Got it.
And importantly, our focus today is laser sharp on the hard problem, the problem of subjective experience itself. We're consciously setting aside what are sometimes called the easy problems.
Like memory, or how the
Right.
brain processes information or controls movement.
Exactly. Those are complex for sure, but science has handles on them. They're problems of function and structure. We're also not delving into other non-physicalist options today, like, say, panpsychism, which is a whole other fascinating area.
Right. Today, it's physicalism versus theism on this specific hard question.
That's the plan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's really define this challenge. David Chalmers famously coined the term hard problem, but the underlying questions have been around for ages. Thomas Nagel's essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, really brought it into focus for many. And the key thing is the hard problem isn't just one single difficulty. It's really about the failure of physicalism to adequately answer two distinct but related questions. Two pillars, if you like.
Okay, what's the first pillar?
The first is the epistemic question. Epistemic just means related to knowledge. So this is the what is it like question. It focuses squarely on that undeniable first-person fact of phenomenal consciousness, the qualia, the subjective feel of things.
Okay, qualia. Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about something really common like drinking water. You might be sipping water right now. I got some here too.
Right.
Objectively, we can share the external experience. Science can map it all out, the H2O molecules, the temperature hitting your tongue, the exact neural signals firing up to your brain's processing centers. We can get incredibly detailed third-person data.
Yeah, science is great at that.
But here's the question. Do I know exactly what it is like for you, subjectively right now, to experience the specific coolness, maybe a slight metallic taste from the tap, or just the sensation of it going down?
No. I can tell you it's cold, but you can't feel my coldness.
Precisely. And that's the core of the epistemic problem. We can use the same objective third-person language, the water is cold, but that language seems fundamentally unable to capture, describe, or transmit the first-person fact, the actual feeling. That coldness feeling is locked inside your subjective frame.
I see. So there's always this gap between the objective, scientific data we can gather and share and the subjective feeling itself. Science can describe the wavelength of red light, but not what it's like for me to see red.
You've got it. And that leads directly into the second pillar, which is arguably even deeper. The ontological question. Ontology is about the nature of being, of existence.
So this is about where consciousness comes from, its source and nature.
Exactly. It asks how and why these subjective conscious experiences, these qualia, could possibly arise from what seem to be completely non-conscious, cold neurobiological processes in the first place.
And this brings us back to that stone analogy you used earlier.
It does. We know that fundamental physical processes, atoms colliding, electrons moving, they lack awareness, they lack meaning, and crucially, they lack intentionality.
Remind us what intentionality means in this philosophical context. It's not about purpose.
Right, it's not about intending to do something. In philosophy, intentionality is the property of being about something, or of something. Your thought about your upcoming holiday is about the holiday. Your fear is of spiders. Physical stuff, like a rock or an electron, doesn't seem to have this aboutness. It just is.
Okay.
So the ontological problem is this. If the basic building blocks of your brain are just these non-intentional, non-aware particles following physical laws, how can arranging them in a very complex way suddenly generate something that is intensely intentional, aware, and filled with meaning, like your thoughts, your feelings, your experiences?
It feels like trying to get something from nothing, in a way.
That's a good way to put it. It asks for the source and nature of this frankly magical seeming leap from blind matter to subjective self-aware experience. How does non-conscious stuff become conscious?
So for physicalism to succeed, it needs to tackle both of these, the knowing problem and the source problem.
Yes. It has to bridge the epistemic gap, explain how we can know about subjectivity from objective facts and solve the ontological problem, explain how non-subjective matter can actually produce or constitute subjectivity. As we'll see, the consensus among many philosophers is that it fails quite dramatically on both counts.
All right, let's dive into one of the most famous arguments against physicalism, one designed to really highlight this failure. It's Frank Jackson's thought experiment about Mary. It's so intuitive, isn't it?
It really is. It cuts through a lot of the complexity and just focuses on this idea of subjective, phenomenal fact. It's powerful.
So paint the picture for us. Who is Mary?
Okay. Imagine Mary is a truly brilliant neuroscientist, but for her entire life, she's been confined to a completely black and white room. She learns about the outside world only through black and white books and monitors.
Okay, a very restricted environment.
Very. But despite this, she becomes the world's leading expert on the science of color vision. She knows every single physical fact there is to know about it.
Like the physics of light waves, how they hit the retina.
Exactly. The different wavelengths, the photochemical reactions in the cone cells, the specific neural pathways, the firing patterns in the visual cortex associated with seeing red, blue, green, everything. If it's a physical fact expressible in the language of physics, chemistry, neuroscience, Mary knows it, all of it.
She has complete physical knowledge about color.
Complete. Then, one day, the door opens, and Mary steps out into the world and sees, for the very first time, a ripe red rose.
Wow. Okay.
The crucial question Jackson asks is, does Mary learn anything new?
Well, my gut reaction is, yes, of course she does. She learns what it's like to actually see red.
Precisely. She learns the phenomenal quality, the subjective experience, the quale of redness. And if she learns something new, Jackson argues, then her previous knowledge, which included all the physical facts, must have been incomplete.
Which means
there are facts about conscious experience that are not physical facts. Therefore, physicalism, the claim that all facts are physical facts, must be false. It simply cannot account for this phenomenal aspect of reality.
that seems devastatingly simple and clear. What's the pushback from physicalists? How do they try to get around Mary?
Well, the main counter-argument, and it's quite clever, is called the ability hypothesis. Proponents of this idea, like David Lewis and Lawrence Nimero, argue that Mary doesn't gain new factual knowledge, or what philosophers call propositional knowledge, knowledge that something is the case.
Okay, so what does she gain then?
They argue she gains new abilities, know-how, rather than know that. She gains the ability to recognize red by sight, the ability to imagine red, the ability to remember the experience of seeing red.
So it's like learning to ride a bike.
Mm.
You can know all the physics, but you don't really know it until you gain the ability.
That's often the analogy used. They say acquiring these abilities doesn't mean acquiring new information about the world, just new skills. So since no new propositional fact was learned, physicalism is supposedly safe.
But, I don't know, that feels a bit like a word game, like sophistry. Can you really separate gaining an ability from gaining knowledge about that ability or the thing it relates to?
That's exactly the critique. It seems very difficult to cleanly separate ability from factual knowledge in many cases. Let's stick with that bicycle analogy because it helps ground this.
Okay.
You can read a detailed manual, all the physics, the biomechanics about riding a bike down a very steep, tricky hill. That's a propositional knowledge, like Mary's knowledge of color science.
Right. All the theory.
But you don't truly know how to do it until you actually get on the bike and try. You practice, you wobble, maybe you fall, and eventually you gain the ability to control your descent.
Yes, definitely an ability gained through practice.
But in the process of gaining that ability, don't you also gain new facts? For instance, you learn the specific fact that on this particular bike, on this specific hill, you need to apply the brakes in a certain way, maybe feathering them gently, pulsing them to avoid overheating the rims or losing control.
Yeah, absolutely. You learn practical facts tied directly to executing the ability correctly. Facts you didn't know just from the manual.
Exactly. That specific braking technique is a piece of propositional knowledge, a fact about how to achieve controlled descent, learned through acquiring the ability. So the argument goes, if gaining an ability logically entails gaining new factual knowledge in cases like the bicycle, why wouldn't it be the same for Mary?
So her new ability to recognize red could also entail gaining the new fact of what it is like to see red.
Precisely. If that's the case, the ability hypothesis doesn't actually save physicalism. It just tries to redirect the question, but the core problem, the new phenomenal knowledge, remains.
It really highlights the difficulty. And some physicalists just give up trying to bridge the gap.
While some adopt what's sometimes called the bite the bullet attitude, they might concede, okay, yes, maybe I can't really know what it's like for you to be in love or to feel the agony of a migraine or even just to see yellow. They acknowledge this epistemic gap regarding subjective states.
But they stick with physicalism anyway.
Yes, they essentially say, look, physical science has been incredibly successful at explaining so much of the world. We're committed to its framework. Even if consciousness, the subjective part, remains a mystery within that framework, we'll just have to live with that mystery rather than abandoning physicalism.
So it becomes a kind of faith in the physicalist worldview, even when it hits a wall.
You could see it that way. It's a choice based on a prior commitment to the scientific method as the only path to knowledge, even when it seems unable to account for a fundamental aspect of our own existence. They prioritize the framework over explaining the phenomenon. It's less an explanation and more an assertion of philosophical preference. Okay, so since those more intuitive arguments and thought experiments pose such a challenge, let's look systematically at the main schools of thought within materialist philosophy that have tried to tackle the hard problem head-on. How do they attempt to logically solve it? Spoiler. They generally run into similar roadblocks.
Right. Where should we start? Which is the most, perhaps, extreme view?
Let's start with the most radical one, eliminative materialism. This is most famously associated with philosophers Patricia and Paul Churchland.
Eliminative. Does that mean they just get rid of consciousness?
Pretty much. Their core claim is quite startling. They argue that phenomenal consciousness are intersubjective experiences like feeling pain, seeing colors, falling in love, doesn't actually exist in the way we think it does.
Wow. So my feeling of pain right now if I stub my toe isn't real.
They would argue that our everyday language for these states, terms like pain, belief, desire, belongs to a primitive, pre-scientific theory they call folk psychology.
Folk psychology, like common sense understanding.
Exactly. And they believe this folk psychology is fundamentally flawed, a bit like ancient theories about witches causing diseases or phlogiston causing fire. They predict that as neuroscience advances, this entire vocabulary of mental states will be eliminated and replaced by a more accurate, purely neuroscientific language.
So instead of saying, I feel happy, we'd say something like, my dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens are elevated, and there's specific firing in pattern X in my prefrontal cortex.
Precisely that kind of thing. They believe talk of subjective feelings will just become obsolete, like talking about demonic possession to explain illness.
That feels incredibly counterintuitive. I mean, the feeling of pain seems like the most real thing there is when you're experiencing it.
Yeah.
How do they justify just eliminating it?
Well, their argument often relies on the history of science, where better theories replaced older ones. But critics, like Jackson again and Philip Pettit, argue that this doesn't logically follow. Just because a new scientific theory comes along doesn't automatically mean the phenomenon described by the older, perhaps less precise theory simply vanishes or was never real.
Right. They used an analogy for this, didn't they? Something about gases.
Yes, the kinetic theory of gases analogy. Imagine we have the standard theory explaining gas behavior based on average molecular motion, giving us concepts like temperature and pressure. Now, suppose we develop a superkinetic theory that tracks every single molecule individually with perfect accuracy.
Okay, a much more detailed fundamental theory.
Right. Would the success of this super theory mean that gases don't really have temperature or pressure anymore, that those concepts should be eliminated?
No, that seems silly. Temperature and pressure are still real measurable properties at the macroscopic level, even if the super theory explains them at a deeper level. They're useful concepts.
Exactly. The higher level description, temperature, still captures real patterns and provides useful information that might even be obscured by the immense detail of the lower level theory. So the argument is that eliminative materialism makes an unwarranted leap. It tries to solve the hard problem by simply denying that the thing we're trying to explain, our first-person subjective experience, actually exists. It throws the baby out with the bathwater.
It basically sidesteps the hard question by claiming the question is based on an illusion.
Precisely. A very unsatisfying answer for most people experiencing consciousness.
Okay, if eliminative materialism is too extreme, what's the next option? Reductive materialism sounds, well, less radical.
It is. Reductive materialism is probably the most common or intuitive view among scientifically minded people. Unlike the eliminativists, reductive materialists absolutely accept that subjective consciousness exists. We do have feelings, experiences, qualia.
Okay, that sounds more promising. So how do they explain it?
They believe that consciousness, while real, can ultimately be reduced to physical states or processes in the brain. It's an identity claim. Consciousness is nothing more than certain types of brain activity.
So the feeling of joy is just a specific pattern of neural firing.
Yes. They'd say there's currently a knowledge gap. We don't know exactly which brain patterns correspond to which feelings yet, but this is just a temporary scientific problem. As neuroscience progresses, they believe we will eventually close this epistemic gap and be able to show the identity. Consciousness will be fully explained in purely physical terms.
Doesn't this run straight back into the problems we discussed earlier? Let's start with the ontological one, the source problem.
It absolutely does. The ontological failure is still there. If the fundamental physical components, the neurons, the atoms, are themselves blind, cold, non-intentional, how does merely arranging them, even in a super complex way, magically make them become awareness or subjectivity?
It's still that leap from non-conscious stuff to conscious experience.
Yeah. Right. Reductive materialists are essentially claiming that two things that seem fundamentally different in kind, objective physical processes and subjective first-person experience, are actually identical. Critics argue this is like saying the more you learn about the physical properties of a table, the more you'll eventually understand the moon. It conflates different categories. Knowing more physical details doesn't magically transform those details into subjective feeling.
And what about the epistemic problem, the what it's like question? Does reductionism solve that?
No, it runs smack into the correlation problem again. Reductive materialists hope that finding perfect correlations mapping exactly which neurons fire when someone reports feeling happy will be the explanation.
But we said correlation isn't explanation.
Exactly. As Professor Annie Rivansuo points out quite vividly, even if you had a perfect map of my brain activity while I'm enjoying a specific, nuanced experience, say, drinking rich hot chocolate on a snowy Sunday morning, wearing my favorite comfy pink slippers.
Okay, very specific.
Mapping all that neural activity tells you nothing about what it is like for me to have that particular cozy, satisfying experience. The entire qualitative, subjective character is completely missing from the third-person neuroscientific data.
You've just linked an objective observation, brain scan, with a subjective report. Ah, this is nice. You haven't accessed or explained the niceness itself.
Precisely. The what it's likeness remains stubbornly private and unexplained by the physical data alone. So reductive materialism accepts consciousness exists, but its strategy for explaining it, finding neural correlates, fundamentally fails to capture the essence of the phenomenon it's trying to explain. It mistakes the map for the territory.
All right, moving on. What's the third main materialist approach?
Functionalism. This one sounds like it focuses on what consciousness does.
That's a good way to think about it. Functionalism shifts the focus away from the stuff consciousness is made of, like neurons or maybe some non-physical substance, and looks instead at its role or function within a system.
Like how a computer program works. Inputs, processing outputs. Exactly. That's a very common analogy. Functionalism often defines mental states, including conscious ones, in terms of their causal relations to three things. 1, sensory inputs, like seeing a speeding bus coming towards you. 2, Other mental states, like the input triggering a state of fear or worry. 3. Behavioral outputs, like the fear state causing you to jump back onto the curb.
So for a functionalist, the mental state of fear is just that intermediate causal role, the thing that's typically caused by dangerous inputs and typically causes avoidance outputs.
Essentially, yes. Consciousness is seen as the functional state of the system, defined by these input-state-output relations. It doesn't matter what the system is made of: neurons, silicon chips, beer cans, and string. As long as it implements the right functional organization, it would have the corresponding mental states.
Okay, I can see how that's useful for understanding, say, how thinking works, or maybe building AI that mimics intelligence. But does it solve the hard problem, the problem of subjective feeling?
Well, that's the major criticism. Functionalism might be brilliant for explaining cognition, information processing, decision-making, the easy problems, but it seems to completely bypass the hard problem of phenomenal consciousness, the qualia.
How so?
Think about a really sophisticated vending machine. You put in money, input, it goes into an internal state, processing the payment, checking stock, and it delivers a soda, output. We understand its function perfectly,
Right.
but does understanding that input-output mechanism tell us anything about what it might be like to be the vending machine while it's performing that function? Or what it's like to be the dollar bill or the soda can?
No, of course not. That question doesn't even seem to make sense for a vending machine.
Exactly. And critics argue it's the same for consciousness. Knowing the complete functional flowchart, how inputs lead to internal states that lead to outputs, doesn't tell you what it feels like to be in that specific internal mental state. It describes the causal role, but not the intrinsic subjective quality.
So it fails the epistemic what it's like question again.
Yes. And it also fails the ontological source question. How do these purely functional processes, defined only by their abstract causal roles and realizable and potentially non-biological systems, suddenly give rise to actual subjective feeling? Especially if those processes are ultimately implemented by non-conscious physical components like transistors or neurons.
It seems like it just describes the structure of the process, but doesn't explain how the lights come on inside, so to speak.
That's a perfect way to put it. Functionalism describes the wiring diagram, maybe even brilliantly, but it doesn't explain the subjective experience of the electricity flowing through it. It explains the function, but not the feeling.
Okay, so if the main philosophical schools, eliminative, reductive, functionalist, all seem to stumble on the hard problem, where do physicalists go next? I know the idea of emergence comes up a lot.
It does. Since the more direct reductionist approaches face such difficulties, many contemporary physicalists appeal to emergent materialism, particularly what's called weak emergence.
Weak emergence, what's the idea there?
The basic claim is that consciousness is an emergent property. It arises from the sheer complexity of the brain's physical processes, the incredibly intricate network of causal connections and interactions between billions of neurons.
So it's a property that isn't present in the individual parts. A single neuron isn't conscious, but it emerges when you put them all together in the right complex way.
Exactly. The whole is more than the sum of its parts, and consciousness is supposedly one of those more things that pops out at a higher level of organization.
This sounds intuitively appealing. Are there common examples used to support this?
Oh, yes. The absolute classic analogy used by physicalists is water H2O.
Right. Hydrogen and oxygen are gases, but put them together and you get liquid water.
And water has properties like being wet, shiny, transparent, liquid at room temperature, properties that you absolutely do not find in individual hydrogen or oxygen atoms or molecules.
So the argument is, see, new, unexpected, irreducible properties can emerge from combining simpler components. Maybe consciousness is just like the wetness of water, but emerging from neurons.
That's precisely the argument. But critics, like the physician and philosopher Raymond Tallis, argue this analogy is deeply flawed when applied to consciousness.
How so? What's wrong with the water analogy?
Tallis points out that when we talk about the emergent properties of water, its liquidity, its shininess, we are still talking about purely physical properties. They are objectively measurable, describable within the language of physics and chemistry. Shininess and liquidity are just different ways we perceive or interact with the underlying physical structure, the H2O molecules and their interactions.
Okay, so it's physical properties emerging from other physical properties.
Exactly. Now compare that to consciousness emerging from neural activity. The supposed emergent property phenomenal experience, the feeling of pain, the subjective redness of red, is not just another physical property of the neurons. It seems to be something of a fundamentally different kind.
It's not objectively measurable in the same way shininess is?
Right. You can't use scientific instruments to detect the sadness in the brain, only the neural activity correlated with the report of sadness. So the leap from neural firing to subjective feeling isn't like the leap from H2O molecules to liquidity, both physical. It's presented as a leap from the physical neurons to the non-physical or mental subjective experience. The water analogy masks this crucial difference in kind.
Hmm, that's a powerful critique. Does emergence face other problems too?
Yes, there's the related charge that it often commits a fallacy of composition or simply begs the question.
What does that mean?
Well, it's true that new properties can emerge when you combine things. You range bricks, which aren't inherently wall-like in a certain way, and you get the emergent property of wallness, hardness, structural integrity. But crucially, the emergent property, wallness, is related to and explainable by the properties of the components, the solidity and shape of the bricks, and their arrangement.
Okay, the properties are of the same general type physical structure.
Right, but with consciousness, the argument is that you're combining non-conscious elements, neurons, atoms, and claiming that a property of a completely different nature, consciousness, awareness, meaning, intentionality, magically emerges. How? Why? Just saying it emerges from complexity isn't an explanation, it's just restating the mystery.
It sounds like saying, and then magic happens.
Pretty much, unless you can provide a mechanism showing how complexity generates subjectivity from non-subjective parts, just invoking emergence doesn't solve the ontological problem. It risks being an empty label for something we don't understand rather than a genuine physical explanation. It assumes the very thing, the possibility of consciousness arising from the purely physical, that it needs to prove.
This whole discussion about complexity and emergence leads almost inevitably to the modern frontier. Artificial intelligence. The big question, can machines actually be conscious?
It's the natural extension, isn't it? If consciousness just emerges from complex physical processing, maybe we can build it.
First, maybe we should clarify the terms. There's weak AI and strong AI, right? What's the difference?
Yes, that's a crucial distinction. Weak AI refers to systems that can simulate intelligence or cognitive functions. They can perform tasks that if a human did them would require thought, things like playing chess, translating languages, recognizing images. Most of the AI we interact with today is weak AI, even the very impressive stuff.
Like chatbots or image generators.
Exactly. They're incredibly sophisticated pattern matching and prediction machines, but the claim isn't necessarily that they understand or feel anything. Strong AI, on the other hand, is the bolder claim. It's the idea that a sufficiently complex AI wouldn't just simulate consciousness, it would literally possess it. It would have genuine understanding, subjective awareness, feelings, qualia.
So if we could build a strong AI, a truly conscious machine made of silicon and wires, just zeros and ones, ultimately that would be game over for non-physicalist views. Physicalism wins.
That's certainly how physicalists would see it. If consciousness can arise from a purely physical, man-made system, it seems to strongly support the idea that consciousness is just a complex physical phenomenon.
But even if strong AI happened, let's say tomorrow, would that automatically disprove theism, for example?
That's a really important point. No, it wouldn't necessarily disprove theism. From a theistic perspective, if humans managed to build a conscious machine, it would simply show that the ultimate conscious being, God, set up the universe and the laws of physics, and perhaps endowed humans with their own consciousness and intelligence in such a way that consciousness could be generated or instantiated through these specific complex physical means.
So the machine's consciousness wouldn't have emerged from nothing, but from a system ultimately grounded in God's consciousness and design, mediated through human ingenuity.
Exactly. As some of the source material notes, the AI would still be, in a sense, a protraction of the rationality of its designers, who themselves received their rational conscious minds from God. The ultimate source question wouldn't necessarily change.
Okay, that's a crucial caveat. Setting that aside, is there a strong philosophical argument against the very possibility of strong AI, regardless of complexity?
Yes, there is, and it's probably the most famous one. John Searle's Chinese room argument. It directly challenges the idea that computation or functional organization alone is sufficient for genuine understanding or consciousness.
Right. The Chinese room. This hinges on a distinction between syntax and semantics.
Precisely. This is absolutely key. Computers, Searle argues, are fundamentally syntactic engines. They manipulate symbols, zeros and ones, letters, pixels according to formal programmed rules. They shuffle symbols based on their shape or structure, syntax, without any grasp of what those symbols mean, semantics.
Whereas human minds operate on meaning.
Yes, Our minds don't just process symbols, they grasp their meaning. They're a reference to things in the world. We have understanding, intentionality. Searle's argument is designed to show that you can have perfect syntactic manipulation without any semantics whatsoever.
Okay, so lay out the thought experiment itself. How does it work?
Searle asks you to imagine yourself inside a closed room. You don't understand a single word of Chinese. You're given a huge rule book written entirely in English, your native language, which functions as the program.
Okay, got the rule book.
Now, slips of paper with sequences of Chinese characters, questions, the input, are passed into the room through a slot. Your rulebook tells you exactly how to correlate these incoming symbols with other Chinese symbols based purely on their shapes. It says things like, if you see squiggle squiggle, write down squoggle squoggle.
So I'm getting matching patterns according to the English instructions.
Exactly. You follow the rules meticulously, assemble sequences of Chinese characters according to the rulebook, and pass them back out through another slot, the output. Let's assume the rulebook is so good, the program is so sophisticated, that the answers you produce are indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker.
So to someone outside the room, it looks like the room, or whoever's inside, understands Chinese perfectly. They ask questions in Chinese, they get perfect answers in Chinese.
Right. It passes the Turing test for understanding Chinese. But here's Searle's killer question. Do you, the person inside the room manipulating the symbols, understand Chinese?
No, not at all. I'm just shuffling meaningless symbols based on rules in English. I still have no idea what the questions or answers mean.
Precisely. You have the syntax, symbol manipulation, down perfectly, but zero semantics, meaning understanding. Searle argues that what's true for you in the room is also true for a digital computer, no matter how complex. It's just manipulating symbols according to a program. It can simulate understanding, maybe flawlessly, but it doesn't have understanding.
So AI, according to Searle, fundamentally lacks intentionality. It can't attach meaning to the symbols it processes.
That's the core claim. It's just syntax manipulation, a very sophisticated form of pattern matching, but it never makes the leap to genuine semantic understanding or subjective awareness. The lights are on, maybe, in terms of processing, but nobody's home in terms of conscious experience or meaning.
But what about the objection that the whole system, the room, the rule book, you understands Chinese, even if you alone don't? Or that if it was massively parallel and complex, understanding would just emerge?
Searle addressed those too. He argues that even if you memorize the rules and internalize the whole system, shuffling symbols in your head, you still wouldn't understand Chinese. And just making the system more complex or faster doesn't magically bridge the gap between syntax, symbol rules, and semantics, meaning. It's a difference in kind, he argues, not just degree or speed. A machine running a program remains a syntax manipulator, not a semantic understander. And all these failures, the intuitive arguments, the specific materialist philosophies, the emergence concept, the AI challenge, they all point towards the inherent limitations of trying to explain consciousness solely within a physicalist framework. This brings us directly to the role and the limits of neuroscience itself.
Right. Neuroscience is often presented as the field that will eventually crack the hard problem. But we need to be careful about its philosophical assumptions, don't we?
Absolutely critical. Neuroscience is not philosophy-free. When neuroscientists design experiments, interpret brain scans, or build models of brain function, they are almost always operating within a pre-existing philosophical framework. Usually some form of physicalism, maybe reductive, maybe emergent.
So their methodology and interpretations are already shaped by the assumption that consciousness must be explainable in physical terms.
Largely, yes. That's not necessarily a criticism of the science itself or its own domain, but it means we can't just assume neuroscience operates in a neutral vacuum when it comes to the hard problem. Its findings are often presented through a physicalist lens.
And the fundamental issue we keep returning to, even with the most advanced brain imaging techniques, is the difference between correlation and explanation.
Exactly. Neuroscience has become incredibly sophisticated at finding neural correlates of consciousness, NCCs. We can pinpoint with amazing precision which brain areas become active when someone reports seeing red, or feeling fear, or making a decision. We can map these correlations beautifully.
We can see the brain doing something when the person reports an experience.
Yes. We can link the firing of neurons in the primary taste cortex to the person saying, that tastes sweet. But, and this is the crucial point we've hit again and again, mapping that correlation is not the same thing as explaining the subjective experience of sweetness itself. Why that pattern of firing feels like anything at all, let alone like sweetness, remains unanswered.
So Neuroscience describes the physical side of the correlation, but it can't seem to cross the bridge to explain the subjective side.
Precisely. It gives us ever more detailed information about the physical machinery, but not the ghost in the machine, so to speak, the subjective experience itself.
And we should stress, this isn't about dismissing neuroscience. It's incredibly valuable, right? For understanding things like memory, attention, sleep, the effects of drugs or injury.
Oh, absolutely invaluable. Think of the practical benefits coming from neuroscience research, like understanding neurological disorders, developing treatments, or even optimizing learning and focus. You mentioned Andrew Huberman earlier. His work is a great example of applying neuroscientific principles for practical benefit. For tackling the easy problems of cognition and brain function, neuroscience is the key.
But it hits a wall when it tries to tackle the metaphysical hard problem.
Exactly. When it steps beyond describing brain mechanisms and tries to explain the fundamental nature and origin of subjective experience itself, its physicalist assumptions become limitations. It leads to what we could call the neurometaphysical dead end.
Can we summarize that as a kind of logical argument?
I think we can. It goes something like this. 1. Neuroscience, especially when addressing consciousness, generally operates under the assumption of physicalism, some form of it. 2. Physicalism, as we've argued, seems incapable of adequately addressing the hard problem of consciousness, both the epistemic and ontological aspects. 3. Therefore, neuroscience, insofar as it remains bound by physicalist assumptions, is also incapable of solving the hard problem.
That seems logically sound, based on our discussion. It frames the limits clearly.
And interestingly, there are even some empirical points raised, though they are perhaps secondary to the main philosophical argument. Philosophers like David Papineau have argued that the empirical case for a strict identity or even necessary correlation between specific brain events and conscious experiences, P, isn't as watertight as sometimes assumed.
Meaning there might be consciousness without the expected brain activity, or vice versa.
Historically, there have been debates about phenomena like consciousness during certain phases of general anesthesia or reports from near-death experiences where complex consciousness is reported despite minimal brain activity. Now, the interpretation of this data is highly contested, of course.
But the point is, even the empirical link isn't perfectly established.
Papineau argued it wasn't definitively proven as necessary, though even if future data showed a perfect, unbreakable correlation, the core philosophical problems, the ontological source problem, and the epistemic what it's like problem would still remain. You'd have perfect correlation, but still no explanation for why the correlation exists or what the subjective side truly is.
So the conclusion isn't science is bad or neuroscience is useless. Not at all.
Absolutely not. The conclusion is that science, specifically neuroscience, operating under physicalist constraints, has limits. When you ask it a fundamentally metaphysical question, what is the nature of subjective experience and how does it arise from matter? A question that potentially requires considering non-physical realities, it's going to struggle because its tools and assumptions are restricted to the physical. You can't measure the non-physical with physical tools.
Okay, so we've spent a good amount of time systematically looking at why physicalism, in its various forms, eliminative, reductive, functionalist, emergent, seems to fail. It runs into these persistent ontological and epistemic roadblocks, largely because of its foundational commitment to explaining everything in purely physical terms.
Right. It hits these paradoxes and explanatory gaps precisely because it restricts the possible toolkit of reality, denying upfront anything non-physical could be involved.
So if the physicalist explanations fail because of this self-imposed restriction, it seems logical to ask.
Yeah.
What if we relax that restriction? What kind of explanation becomes possible then? This leads us towards theism.
Exactly. This is the crucial pivot. If physicalism fails, we need to consider alternative metaphysical frameworks. Theism offers a fundamentally different starting point because it explicitly includes a non-physical dimension to reality, namely God, who is conceived as inherently conscious, aware, and intentional.
So how does a theistic framework address that core ontological problem, the source of consciousness that physicalism struggled so much with?
Well, the theistic answer is remarkably straightforward and arguably more intuitive. It posits that consciousness, life, awareness, intentionality, meaning all the things mysteriously absent in fundamental physical particles, originate from God.
Because God possesses these qualities inherently.
Precisely. In Islamic theology, for instance, God, Allah, is described with attributes like Al-Hay, the ever-living, and Al-Alim, the all-knowing, or Al-Kabir, the all-aware. You see references like Allah, there is no God but He, the ever-living, the sustainer of all existence. Quran 2.255, or does He who created not know while He is the subtle, the acquainted? Quran 67.14.
So the logic is, life comes from the source of life, awareness from the source of awareness. That seems, well, logical, unlike getting awareness from non-aware matter.
Exactly. It avoids the fundamental paradox of physicalism, which has to somehow explain how consciousness pops into existence from ingredients that completely lack it. In theism, consciousness originates from a source that is supremely conscious. There's no need for a magical emergence from its opposite.
It avoids that awkward stone suddenly feeling the butterfly problem.
It does. The butterfly's flutter is perceived because the perceiver derives their capacity for perception from an ultimately aware source.
Now, does adopting this theistic view mean we have to throw out all the neuroscience we just discussed? Do we reject the brain's role?
Not at all, and this is really important. The most sophisticated theistic approaches embrace a form of dualism, but not the simplistic ghost completely separate from the machine's caricature. A common framework is called integrated dualism, associated with philosophers like Charles Taliaferro.
Integrated dualism, what does that entail?
It fully accepts and integrates the findings of neurobiology. It acknowledges that in our current existence, consciousness is intimately connected with and interacts with the physical brain. The brain is the necessary physical instrument or vehicle for consciousness to function and express itself in this world. This is sometimes called psychophysical interaction.
So the mind and brain are distinct, but deeply linked.
Yes, they are metaphysically distinct realities. Mind consciousness isn't reducible to brain matter, but they are integrated and depend on each other for functioning in this life.
Is there a helpful analogy for this?
The classic one, which we touched on briefly, is the car and driver analogy.
Right. The brain is the car, consciousness is the driver.
Exactly. The car, brain, and the driver, consciousness, mind, soul, are clearly distinct things. But for the driver to navigate and interact with the physical world, they need the car. And the car needs the driver to operate purposefully.
And if the car gets damaged, say engine trouble or a flat tire analogous to a stroke or brain injury,
Then the driver's ability to move, perceive, and interact with the world through the car is severely impaired. The driver might seem slow, unresponsive, or unable to perform tasks. But, and this is a crucial point, the damage to the car doesn't mean the driver has ceased to exist or has become identical to the damaged engine part.
the driver still exists, distinct from the car, even if their ability to use the car is compromised.
Precisely. The driver's consciousness might be temporarily unable to express itself fully through the damaged physical vehicle, but the consciousness itself, being metaphysically distinct, is not destroyed or reducible to the broken machinery.
And some people find support for this view in things like near-death experiences.
Yes, that's often cited. While controversial and subject to various interpretations, proponents point to accounts where individuals report having clear, complex, subjective conscious experiences, seeing things, hearing things, feeling emotions, forming memories, while their brain activity is severely compromised or clinically non-existent. The car is essentially turned off or broken down.
So the argument is, the driver seems to be functioning even when the car isn't.
That's the inference drawn by some that consciousness persists even when the physical substrate seems incapable of supporting it, suggesting its distinct nature.
Okay, so wrapping up this section, the argument is that theism, particularly through a model like integrated dualism, offers a more powerful explanation.
Yes, the claim is that it provides a stronger, more intuitive, and more logically coherent metaphysical framework. It can account for the source of consciousness, God's inherent awareness, its nature, distinct but integrated with the physical, and its existence as a fundamental aspect of reality derived from the source, all while fully accommodating the findings of neuroscience regarding brain-mind correlation and interaction. It avoids the paradoxes that physicalism seems structurally unable to overcome.
So let's bring this all together. We've journeyed through some pretty deep philosophical waters, dissecting the hard problem, looking at why physicalism struggles, and exploring the theistic alternative. What's the core takeaway for someone listening to all this?
I think the main point is realizing that this debate about consciousness isn't just a scientific problem waiting for more data. It's fundamentally a metaphysical debate about the nature of reality itself.
And the physicalist approach, by defining reality only as the physical, seems to write checks it can't cash when it comes to explaining our own subjective experience.
Yeah.
It hits dead ends.
Exactly. It creates these insurmountable gaps, the what it's like gap, the source gap. But a framework like integrated dualism, rooted in theism, which allows for both physical and non-physical dimensions.
It lets science do its valuable work on the physical side, studying the brain, the correlations, the easy problems.
Right, science can flourish in understanding the car, but the theistic framework also provides a coherent, rational, and intuitive explanation for the driver for the existence and source of subjective reality itself, grounding it in the creator's awareness.
And this isn't just abstract philosophy, is it? It connects directly to something deeply personal and spiritual.
Absolutely. When you really absorb the implications, when you move past the arguments and just reflect on your own moment-to-moment awareness, you realize something profound. Every single conscious moment you experience, every sight, sound, thought, feeling is, as the source material puts it so well, a priceless gift.
Priceless. How so?
Well, think about it. Would you trade tomorrow's consciousness? If someone offered you, say, 10 million pounds cash right now, on the condition that you simply wouldn't wake up tomorrow morning, you'd forfeit that next day of subjective experience, would you take the deal?
No way. Absolutely not. Not for any amount of money.
Of course not, because that conscious experience, even just one more day of it, is intrinsically valuable beyond measure. It's something, as the source says, we don't earn, own, or deserve. It's just given continuously.
And recognizing that it's an unearned, priceless, continuous gift, yeah, where does that lead?
It leads inevitably, or at least it should lead, to ultimate gratitude and praise. To Alhamdulillah, all praise and thanks are due to God. Your very consciousness becomes the most intimate, undeniable sign, a constantly unfolding miracle right within you, pointing to the power, the generosity, the perfection, and the sheer reality of the giver.
So consciousness itself becomes a proof, in a way, and a reason for worship.
A profound sign, yes. It confirms God's attributes and his worthiness of that gratitude, that praise, that worship. We often get tangled up in the intellectual knots, the merry arguments, the Chinese rooms, the neuroscience debates, and those are important for clarity.
But they aren't the end goal.
No. The ultimate purpose of understanding consciousness from this perspective isn't just winning a philosophical debate. It's to recognize the reality of God's creative act in every moment of your awareness, and then to align your life, your inner state of awe and gratitude, and your outer actions of worship and service with that fundamental reality.
That's a powerful connection. So maybe a final thought for our listeners to take away and reflect on.
Perhaps this. We've spent this time exploring why your consciousness, your subjective what it's like to be you, doesn't seem logically or ontologically derivable just from the blind, cold, physical matter of your brain. It appears to be something more, something given.
So the question is,
What does this ongoing, moment-by-moment miracle of your own self-awareness tell you, personally, right now, about the ultimate source of your existence? And what might be the purpose for which you were granted this truly priceless gift?
a profound question indeed, something to really sit with. Thank you for guiding us through this incredibly complex topic.
Thank you. It's been a fascinating deep dive. Hopefully, it's given everyone listening a fresh perspective on really the most intimate mystery there is the miracle inside their own mind.
We certainly hope so. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.